So as you know, the church and Christianity in general, they're often seen as being the great enemies of freedom and diversity, whereas the truth is actually quite the opposite. Christianity, if properly understood, is actually the great champion of both of these things, the great champion of diversity and freedom. And this comes through in a whole bunch of different passages you find up and down in the Bible, but I want to focus on two. One from the Old Testament and another one from the New Testament. So first of all, book of Numbers, chapter 11. The story involving the prophet Moses. He's stressed out, he's wanting to tap out, and so he prays to the Lord, and the Lord inspires him to summon 70 guys to help him out. And so they come up with a plan. We'll establish a meeting, time and date, we'll engage in some sort of ritual, and hopefully the grace of God will descend upon us. And that's what happens. So they receive the gift of the Spirit, they receive the gift of prophecy. But then someone comes up to Moses. Moses, guess what? There's these two guys, Eldad and Medad. They weren't at the meeting. But they received the gift of the Spirit. They too received the gift of prophecy. In response to which Moses says what? Would that all people receive the gift of the Spirit? Would that all people receive the gift of prophecy? Loosely translated, who cares? They weren't at the meeting. So what? They have the gift of the Spirit, they have the gift of prophecy. God in His providence has blessed them. By extension, He's blessing us, so why are you worried? Why are you scandalized? This is a good thing. You see a similar thing when it comes to the gospel. Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. So, similar thing. Apostle John goes up to Christ. Guess what? We saw someone casting out demons. He's not part of our group. What saith you, Rabbi? First of all, he says, well, no one can do a deed of power in my name and later speak ill of me. That person will eventually come around. And the second thing, he says, whoever is not against us is for us. So again, here's a guy, he's casting out demons. That's a good thing. Again, don't be worried, don't be scandalized, don't go the way of envy and jealousy. This is a good thing. God has blessed them, and by extension, He's blessing each one of us. A lot of things you can say about these stories collectively, but I want to focus on a few points. The first point is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, point 1257. So just as a loose paraphrase, what this statement conveys is this notion that the Catholic Church is the sacrament of salvation. The Catholic Church is the ordinary means by which God wishes to convey grace and salvation to the world. At the same time, this is the point, God is not limited to these things. The ordinary way that God wishes to convey grace and blessings to the world is through liturgy, priesthood, the magisterium, all these different things you find within the fabric of the Holy Catholic Church. But at the same time, for example, when you look at your day, the different ways that God blesses you, He blesses you in all sorts of different ways, which goes beyond, for example, parish life. And so the Catechism is highlighting that particular dynamic. It's important for us to recognize that and receive it with joy. The example that comes to mind, so as you know, I like watching movies, but ironically, I don't really like typically religious films. I find them kind of annoying. They're getting better, but I think you know what I mean. A lot of times they're kind of self-conscious. They're trying to hide a certain message in the thing at the expense of just focusing on making a good film. In contrast, if you have a filmmaker who's just focused on making a good film, I'm just focused on making a good film, a beautiful movie, without worrying about political undertones. Funny enough, that type of movie tends to be a lot more inspiring in a very natural and organic sort of way. So ironically, you have a film which might not be explicitly religious, but it has a more religious sensibility. But you see the point, right? If I focus on discovering the beautiful film that I'm meant to make, and I'm successful in that regard, that film, ironically, will be more of the Lord, even though it might not be explicitly religious. Because Jesus Christ is not just the way, the truth, and life. He is the good, the true, and the beautiful. Second point, sort of a parallel thing to the first, right? We're not advocating a certain religious syncretism. We're not saying all religions are the same. We're not saying there's no such thing as truth, because all this presumes goodwill, sincerity, and authenticity. This comes through in a really interesting story from Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12. So basically, in the context of this story, there's like 7 charlatans. There's 7 guys who are pretending to be exorcists. They're pretending they have the power to cast out demons, and they're charging money for this, which is fine, so they come across a guy who's actually possessed by a demon. So they go to this guy and are like, look, in the name of Jesus, preached about by Paul, I cast you out. And the demon says, I've heard of Jesus, I've heard of Paul, but who are you? And they're like, oh no. So they become possessed, and the story ends with them running away naked and wounded. Right? So You see the point though, right? So those guys, they lack goodwill. But in contrast, people like Eldad and Medad and that guy casting out demons from the Gospel of Mark, they have sincerity, they have authenticity. So even though initially they're not part of the right group, they're going to be okay. If they pursued a thing and they maintain that particular interior disposition, eventually they'll come to rest in the fullness of Christ. Bishop Barron talks about this, right? So basically what he says, there's what's called the three great transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And the idea is that these things are mutually implicative. Regardless of which one you start with, if you pursue it to its logical ends, you'll eventually come to rest in the other two. So, for example, let's say we're talking about baseball. Whether you begin by studying the rules, tossing a ball around, watching a professional game, right? Otherwise known as the true, the good, and the beautiful. If you pursue the thing to its logical end, eventually, guess what? You're going to love baseball. Same principle applies when it comes to the Christian thing. So if you have someone and they're sincere in the pursuit of the good, the true, or the beautiful, eventually that person will come to rest in the other two, and eventually they'll come to rest in Christ, because Jesus Christ, again, he's not just the way, the truth, and the life. He is the good, the true, and the beautiful. One final point. Oftentimes, the good, the true, and the beautiful come to you in packaging you don't expect. In that moment, it's really important that you don't respond by way of anger or envy or jealousy or scandal, but receive the thing with joy, with gratitude, with thanksgiving. I'll give you an example. So, as you know, before I became a priest, I was a lawyer. And my favorite law firm was the last law firm I worked for. And so I remember it was my first day. I went up to the senior lawyer for whom I worked for a while. And I had this assignment, and I wanted to make sure I did it right, So I went to him, and I just asked him, how do you want me to do this? And I had a certain expectation. I thought he would say to me, look, I want you to do it this way, in this particular way, basically how I do it. But he surprised me. He said, you know what? You're a smart guy. You've done this before. Just do it however you want to do it. And if I have comments, I'll make comments, but we'll see what you got. Okay. So I did it, and I brought it back to him. He had a few comments, but not that much. And also I got the sense that he changed his own process based on how I solved the problem, even though I was a junior lawyer and he was a senior lawyer, right? So you see the point, though. He was looking at my work and saying, well, look, just because you're approaching the issue and the problem in a different way doesn't mean it's wrong. And in fact, it's very important for me to see how I can benefit from your new way of approaching the issue, your particular way of solving the problem. It's not just doing you a favor, it's doing me a favor. It's doing the firm a favor. I always remember that. He was the best boss I ever had. I carried that with me forward when I became pastor of my own parish in Oshawa. So you probably noticed, every time I become pastor at a parish, there's no staff. I don't know why that is. Pros and cons. Anyways, so in Oshawa, I was looking for someone to fill a very important position, and I remember it was a really long interview process. So a bunch of people applied, but in terms of in-person interviews, we did 25, 30 interviews. And I remember one of the greatest obstacles was I was looking for a particular type of worker. I wanted someone who could think independently within a team concept. You think that'd be easy to find, but actually it's quite difficult. And I remember a friend of mine coming to me and saying, Father, I think you gotta set the bar way lower. People are used to being robots. They're used to having the employer say, look, this is what I want you to do in this particular way, and no room for freedom or flexibility. So I think you just gotta settle for that. To which I was like, no. I'm not gonna create a structure which encourages people to be robots. I'm not going to create an environment which encourages people to be less than free, because there's a lot at stake here. It's not just my own personal way of managing the parish, right? We're teaching people how to be human, how to be free. We're teaching people what it means to live in the context of authentic Christian community. So we're not going to settle. And eventually we found someone, and it was great, But hopefully you see the point. There is right and wrong, true and false. There is a time and place to have common goals, common mission, common purpose. That's the whole dynamic of team, right? But within that space, there's meant to be flexibility, freedom, respect for the dignity of the human person, room for all sorts of legitimate forms of diversity. And here's the point. It's not just good for other people. It's good for us. It's good for you. It's good for the community. It's good for the church, and it's good for the world.